Welcome to the Contracting Officer Podcast. It's not just for contracting officers. If you're anywhere in the GovCon world, this podcast is for you. Today we're talking about broad agency announcements, and this episode is brought to you, as usual, by Skyway Acquisition. Check out skywaymember.com or listen to the end to learn more. Let's get right into it. Here we go with broad agency announcements. What if you don't know exactly how to solve your problems? If you're at home, you Google it and maybe watch some YouTube videos of different ways other people have solved similar problems. Market research is what you're doing. But what if no one else has ever solved the problem? And how does the government do that with all the restrictions that are inherent in the GovCon world?
It's easier than you think. It happens all the time through, for example, the broad agency announcement, the BAA. We talked in episode 172 about requirements versus solutions. And in a traditional acquisition process, the government has a requirement and they need you to solve the requirement. In this case, with the BAA, the government doesn't need a firm specification. They don't need you to have a detailed requirement. They don't need to have their own detailed requirement. But they can fund your solution in an effort to try to solve a problem. A broad, hence the term broad agency announcement, broad problem versus a specific requirement they're trying to solve. Yeah,
it's really cool. You might not know how to solve the problem. You might not have a solution. You might have an idea of how it can be solved, and they'll give you money to further that idea. Before we further anything else, let's stop and say thanks.
Thanks this week goes to Brett Robinson. Brett is a business analyst at Corner Alliance in Parker, Colorado. Corner Alliance provides public safety, emergency management, and business intelligence services to their federal clients. Brett is also an active podcast listener. I want to thank Brett for sharing his story about how he found our podcast and how he uses it when I had a podcast feedback call with him. The input from our listeners ensures we are doing everything we can to keep this podcast useful and relevant to our listeners' needs. So when I get to talk to him, it really helps a lot. Brett is also a Skyway community member. It's members like Brett who enable us to bring you this podcast for free each week. If you're not a member yet, go to skywayacq.com for details.
Good plug. Thanks, Brett. And now back to broad agency announcements. A broad agency announcement, a BAA, we'll say that from now on, is one of the ways the government can request scientific or research proposals in broad areas of interest. That's the broad in BAA. BAAs cover a focus area instead of a specific product or service. Like you said, it's more, I sort of have a problem and I need ideas, not here's exactly the thing that I need you to solve for me. You need to build me something that is 1 foot square and weighs 16 kilograms. I mixed feet and metric.
And what you just described there, that's what the RFP process is for. That defined requirement that they're going to compete to get a contract that solves that individual known problem. That's the RFP process. This is different.
Jump into the FAR. It's FAR part 35. So 35.016 is broad agency announcement. And this tells you how you use them and what you need to do to release a BAA. It says BAAs are used to acquire basic and applied research and that part of development that is not related to the development of a specific system or hardware procurement. BAAs may be used by agencies to buy scientific study and experimentation directed toward advancing the state of the art or increasing knowledge or understanding rather than focusing on a specific system or hardware solution. So it says that twice. Specific system, it's not for specific systems or specific hardware solutions. It's for advancing the state of the art or learning more. To release a BAA, it says the BAA, together with supporting documents, shall describe the agency's research interest, either for individual program requirements or broadly defined full range of agencies' requirements. So this is the focus areas. You need to describe the criteria for selecting proposals, their relative importance, and the method of evaluation, and we'll talk about that in a minute, different than a usual source selection. You need to specify the period of time during which proposals submitted in response to the BAA will be accepted. So how long is this BAA open? And you need to give them some instructions for preparation and submission proposals. Like, it's not just wide open, submit me 1,000 pages. Usually BAAs are specific and say, I need 10 pages on this or 5 pages on that, right? Tell me about this, tell me about that. Don't worry about the rest of the stuff.
And finally, the availability of this BAA, it must be published through the, in quotes, the government point of entry, which is currently known as beta.sam.gov. We talked about that in episode 263. But they basically have to publish this. The government has to publish this to the world. It's not a broad agency announcement that only a select people get to go after. It's published on the government point of entry. In addition, if authorized pursuant to FAR 5.5, which is about publishing opportunities, the government can also publish it in noted, and as it's in there, noted scientific, technical, or engineering periodicals.
Right.
In other words, get the word out.
Yeah, that's great. Rather than hoping that people that are doing this type of research are looking at the contract opportunities section of beta.sam.gov on a regular basis, you can actually publish it in places that these people go to read.
Because the point of that is people who aren't actively in the government market already, in other words, they're not looking on beta.sam.gov, how are they going to find it? That's relevant because you're looking for any ideas you can get to solve this problem.
Yep.
That's a different approach.
Go where they are.
Yeah, there you go.
Let's talk about how they're evaluated. 35.016 also talks about evaluations. It says proposals received as a result of the BAA shall be evaluated in accordance with evaluation criteria specified therein through a peer or a scientific review process.
Notice that's not a compliance review in accordance with FAR Part 15. There's a compliance in that you have to do it and how the BAA instructions are laid out. But a peer and scientific review process, that's big brains looking at, can you actually solve this problem? Is this going to advance the state of the art?
Yep.
That's a judgment call. That is not a FAR Part 15 strategy.
Yep. So you have to tell them sort of how you're going to evaluate it, but there's much more judgment involved here. The FAR actually says written evaluation reports on individual proposals will be necessary. You got to at least write up why you selected it. Right?
You got to document it, right?
But proposals need not be evaluated against each other because they're not submitted in accordance with a common work statement, right? There's nothing to compare.
Again, that's fundamentally different than how a traditional competitive acquisition is run.
Right. And here's another difference. The primary basis for selecting proposals for acceptance shall be technical, importance to agency programs, and funds availability. It also says cost realism and reasonableness shall also be considered to the extent appropriate.
And it's really different from how traditional acquisitions are done.
So evaluations here, it's really up to judgment. You're going to look at the technical merits of the solution, how important is it to furthering the state of the art in your agency, and whether or not you have money. And for government statistics purposes, if you award under a BAA, you are meeting the statutory requirement for competition. This counts as, yay, we competed this, and agencies get judged. We've talked before. Agencies get judged on the amount of dollars that they award under competition. So it's another encouraging factor. Let's stop real quick, link this to the acquisition time zones and the execution time zones. We already said there's not a firm requirement, so we're skipping over the requirement zone. This is how the government actually helps develop future requirements, right? The BAA process is sort of market research. Even though the BAA will have an RFP and a source selection that are RFP and source selection zone kind of things, that whole process can actually be considered market research for a larger acquisition to come, right? If you show promise in solving a problem for the government, they may say, all right, now we know the technological know-how is there, so we're going to do a competition for a big something that relies on this technology. Does that make sense?
Yep, and you're in a really good position to be able to win that competition.
Right. And that's sort of like the execution time zone kind of thing. It's not technically a recompete of the BAA, but it's a furtherance of the technology that was developed under the BAA, and it sort of makes you the incumbent.
During the recompete zone, the government's going to decide on the acquisition strategy. I've done sole source contracts to follow on from a BAA. We've done competitions. We've just extended the BAA, extended the contract, added, exercise an option.
Yeah.
A lot of different ways they can go with that. So you're right. It's not really a recompete. It's what's next? What's the next level? Because this is for basic and applied research. So it's going somewhere. This is the first step on some journey, right? So the journey is going to be facilitated by a follow-on acquisition strategy.
Or it could be a dead end. They could try it, say,
or it could not work.
That's not how it goes. And,
exactly. We wasted $200,000, but now we know it doesn't work. And so we move on.
Right.
Which is still better than competing it and finding it doesn't work afterwards.
Right. We still furthered our knowledge that this isn't a way to do it.
This is a bad idea. That's true.
Right.
And if you're not familiar with the acquisition time zones, they're in episode number 3, and the execution time zones are in episode 84.
Broad agency announcements, BAAs, are a very important way that the government can get access to new technologies, to new solutions, and to new companies who may not yet be active in the GovCon world. Or universities can also apply, right? It's research. Any research institution may be able to solve problems, may not be thinking about the government as someone that will fund them to solve a problem.
That's why in previous comment we made about how the government can publish it in the beta.sam.gov, but also in technical periodicals and other places, because these new companies who may not be active in the GovCon world, they're not looking at beta.sam.gov. So that's why this is designed to reach new people, get new ideas, get new solutions.
It's casting a wide net. Now I sound like you. You're always the wide net guy. But it's this is how the government casts a wide net. You say, I have problems I need to solve. I worked at the National Reconnaissance Office for years, and they have a program called the Directors Innovation Initiative, the DII. And it's every year, it's an open BAA where they say, this year we're interested in technologies that might help us farther remote sensing capabilities, right? Right. Sensing things from space. That's what the NRO does. That's pretty broad. There's usually half a dozen areas like that if you have any ideas that could help with this type of problem, you can follow their instructions, submit a proposal, and they might give you a little bit of money to prove that hey, this idea could work. And if it works, that idea could get incorporated into a future program. Like you said, they might fund farther development. They might compete farther development if there's a lot of people that could do it. Or if it works, they could say, great, this is going on the next round of satellites. The next payloads we build are going to rely on this advancement that you did, and your company could be a part of it. So it's not so much the government saying, this is exactly the problem we need solved. It's, we don't even know what we need solved. What ideas do you have that could make this better?
Hence the wide net.
Yeah. All right, specifically on the government side, although I'm not sure which side I was talking about there. BAs are competition, right? It's not skipping the process, but it really does streamline it. Contracting officers can award based on, like we said, technical importance to agency programs and funding availability. It's not which one's better. You could fund 3 contractors, 3 companies to look at the same problem without any preference. Or you could just say, these 3 all have a sort of idea, but this one has the most technical promise from our standpoint. So we're just going to give money to that one company to do it. You don't go through that whole protest and did you evaluate it exactly like you said? It's much more like, I always say this, the real world. I'm air quoting there. I like this. I want to do this. I can do this.
This is not just for buying anything, though. Unlike the real world, quote unquote, the non-government world, where you could use this process for anything that you want to buy, this is limited. It's limited to R&D. It is a great way to get access to new ideas, though, as we've been talking about. I mean, new companies that the government may not be familiar with, they're capable of winning through this, quote, competitive process. That's what makes it cool. It's not a sole source contract. As an acquisition strategy, if we want the company that can do this, we can get it and give them a sole source contract, but there's a process for that Part 6 kicks in. It's extra, right? Whereas in this case, like you said, you could have 3 different companies that do something similar, and you can award all 3 contracts, and they're considered competed. So you're moving things along, because the BA allows the government to not compare apples to apples. And the potential solutions, they may be as different as apples and tire irons. but they can solve the government's problem because it's an apple. You throw it, it does one thing. You throw a tire on it, it does something else. But they both solve the problem in a different way, right? So that idea of, okay, we can try both. To do that, to pick between an apple and a tire iron in a traditional acquisition, regardless of micro purchase all the way up to Far Part 15, full and open competition, that's a nightmare. Whereas with BAA, you can get it done.
You said something in there. You said capable of winning, and I want to. I don't know if I want to clarify or if I want to say it differently.
Pull on that string.
This is how the government gets access to new companies who would not and could not compete if there was a requirement that the government wrote and said, submit a proposal exactly like this. And now you got to compete with all these other GovCon companies that have these well-developed proposal writing systems, right? That's not how this works. This makes it easy for folks to receive funding from the government to further ideas that otherwise wouldn't even think or be capable of playing. Maybe I just said the same thing a different way, but I wanted to circle back to that.
No, you raise a good point. There's a difference between being able to get this opportunity and not even being interested in competing through the traditional process to share this solution with the government. So it's a benefit to both. Government may not have even heard about this if not the BAA process, and the company wouldn't have considered going through the traditional process to compete for it because they're like, I know this works. You want it or not? That's kind of what the BAA says.
That shifts us to the industry side. It may not even be, I know this works. It may be, I got an idea of how this could work, but I don't want to invest the money myself, or I can't invest the money myself to prove that it works. Government, would you like to invest the money to prove that it works? And the government says, yes, that sounds like a great idea. This is an easy entry point to GovCon. If you're an R&D company, if you're an R&D organization or university or a university lab that does research and development, this is a huge opportunity for you. Most government agencies have used BAAs, and many of them have open BAAs right now.
Agencies like the DoD, I found ones from Department of Homeland Security. Of course, there are ones from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, U.S. Agency for International Development, lots of different agencies use these BAAs for broad stuff, hence the broad in BAA.
Yeah, and they're generally open for a long time. I mentioned the NRO's DII to go back to a bunch of acronyms. That's open like all year. Like it's the FY 2020 BAA, and as long as you submit sometime while it's open, it's not the kind of thing where we're releasing an RFP and proposals are due 45 days from now. It's, hey, anytime during the year, if you have an idea, submit it. Now, if you wait too long, they might be out of money because they only have a limited budget for these things.
Yep.
So it's a good idea to get it in early. But if 6 months after it's released, you have an idea, submit away. This is a great way to get exposure for your ideas to new customers who are not yet aware of your capabilities. So if they're not aware, that means they're not interested or committed to buying anything. But you can march in the door or submit through the internet. You can submit your idea, and they might say, wow, we've never heard of you and had no idea that there were companies working on solving problems this way. We'd like to give you a little money to further this and prove to us that this is a good path to follow.
To expand on something that you mentioned, that unlike a traditional RFP, where if the first time you saw this opportunity was when the RFP dropped, you're behind. This doesn't operate the same way. So this is one of those few times where you happen to stumble across a BAA that's been open for 3 months, but it's still open for another 9 months. It doesn't put you at a competitive disadvantage because it doesn't operate the same way. So the fundamental differences of the BAA just keep popping up through this conversation.
Yeah, that's a good point. We say that all the time, that if the first time you're hearing about an opportunity is when it's released on contract opportunities on beta.sam.gov, it was so much easier to say Fed Biz Ops back in the day. We got to figure out better lingo for that. But if the first time you see it's when it's posted, we usually say, "Oh, you're too late. Other people are ahead of you." In this case, that's not always true. Although, like I said, submitting earlier is better before they run out of money. Yes. But it's not a death knell like it would be for a regular competition. I don't want to say that's the death knell for this podcast episode, but I'm going to use that as the segue to let's wrap this thing up and talk about how to apply this, what you can do.
That's a dark closing
I know.
point.
That's why I didn't want to say it that way, even though I did.
On the government side, make sure industry, and especially small businesses, know about BAAs. Share this episode, for example. But it's important that they understand how this is different. When they see this and go, oh, well, I don't know that agency. I'm not going to be able to compete with the companies that dominate there. I'm not going to bid. This isn't the same. So educate them on the difference between a BAA and a traditional competitive acquisition. Also, be sure you had the technical team available, or they can even be contractors. Contractors as evaluators. We did a whole episode about that. But they clearly have to explain why a particular proposal is worth funding. And we talked about, I think they said that a scientific peer review board. You have to have those brains in place to say, okay, this one, we have $100,000 to spend. This one is worth spending $30,000 on. This one is worth spending all $100,000 on. You got to have the brain to be able to tell the difference between those two. And I got to tell you, it ain't me as a contracting officer.
Right.
Because when I did BAAs and they'd ask me which one, I'm like, I have no idea. So that's a big thing, is get those brains in place ahead of time. Otherwise, raising my hand, you get a bunch of BAA proposals come in and they sit, which is frustrating as possible it can be for industry. Because they're like, I sent this in, what's the response? And part of it could be, we can't get through them fast enough because we don't have those brains in place.
Yeah.
So if you're going to use this approach, make sure you got the technical brains in place, even if they're contractors.
Industry folks, BAAs are a great entry point to new agencies. It's a great entry point to new work with agencies that you already work with. And like we said, it's a great way to make yourself sort of the de facto incumbent for a technology. It's not a bad idea to talk to an agency before you submit a BAA, because BAAs are open all the time. There's not the same kind of restrictions. So smart companies usually get in touch with the technical folks at an agency and say, I have an idea. Is this even worth submitting before they spend the time to write the proposal, right? You got to warm the oven up before you put the pizza in, or it doesn't cook.
And yeah, that's targeting. You're talking about targeting, because there are basically two approaches to this. You can target your capabilities, whatever capability you have. You can target it to all BAAs. You can go into contract opportunities and honestly just Google agency BAAs in the context of what you do, and you're going to find lots of them. That's option A, is to go after all the BAAs. Option B, which is more to what you just mentioned, is to target individual agencies through understanding what their needs are, and then go after their BAAs. You're more likely to get funding through that process because you're much more likely to have a solution they could actually use. So option B takes longer. That's the whole idea of targeting down to the agency, then waiting for the BAA. Because if you're looking for BAAs, you're going to find them. There's plenty of them you could bid on 24/7. But it takes longer to get to the targeting level. But to your point, especially if you have a relationship with somebody at the agency that you can float an idea past, you're going to be able to self-eliminate the ones that, while they're a great idea, while it's a beautiful BAA proposal you're sending in, it's not going to get funded.
Yeah.
Because you're just not close enough to solving their problem.
Yeah. Link it to your long-term strategy, right? Just sending in it. If you're just looking to get something funded, maybe any agency will do. But if you want to build a long-term relationship that, like I said, creates the de facto incumbency for you, then go with the agencies that have where your long-term interests are linked. And with that,
our long-term interest is to end in less than 30 minutes.
I'll talk to you soon, Kevin.
I'll see you, Paul.
All right, thanks for joining us this week. If you enjoyed today's episode, we invite you to check out the Skyway community at skywaymember.com. Skyway's team of contracting officers can help you interpret those BAA instructions and submit a successful BAA proposal. Again, skywaymember.com, or call us at 877-884-5280. We'll see you next week.